and welcome to Be Mom. It's Becky, and we're going to read Curious George Goes to the Hospital by Margaret and H.A. Ray. I had a friend who mentioned how much they liked the Curious George stories. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat, but he was a curious little monkey. This is George. He lived with his friend, the man with the yellow hat. He was a good little monkey, but he was always curious. Today, George was curious about the big box on the man's desk. Here's George with the big box. What could it be? George could not resist. He simply had to open it. It was full of funny little pieces of all sorts of shapes and colors. George took one out. It looked like a piece of candy. Maybe it was candy. Maybe he could eat it. George put the piece in his mouth, and before he knew it, he had swallowed it. Moms and dads can read for you. That's not candy. He doesn't look so happy, does he? A little while later, the man with the yellow hat came home. Why, George, he said, I see you have already opened the box with the jigsaw puzzle. It was supposed to be a surprise for you. Well, let's go to work on it. Finally, the puzzle was finished. Well, almost finished. One piece was missing. We know where it went, don't we? The man looked for it everywhere, but he could not find it. That's strange, he said. It was a brand new puzzle. Well, it cannot be helped. Maybe we'll find it in the morning. Let's go to bed now, George. The next morning, George did not feel well. He had a tummy ache and he did not want to eat his breakfast. The man was worried. He went to the telephone and called Dr. Baker. I'll be over as soon as I can, said the doctor. First, Dr. Baker looked down George's throat and felt his tummy. Then he took out his stethoscope and he listened. I'm not sure what's wrong, he said. You'd better take George to the hospital and have an x-ray. And I'll call them and let them know you're coming. Don't worry, George, said the man when they were driving to the hospital. You've been there before when you broke your leg. Remember how nice the doctors and nurses were? George held his big rubber ball as tight as they walked up the hospital steps. He's a little scared, isn't he? I'm so glad the man with the yellow hat is with him. The nurse took them down a long hallway to a room where she gave George something to drink that was white and tasted sweet. It's called barium, the nurse explained. It helps the doctors find out what's wrong with you, George. In the next room stood a big table, and a doctor was just putting on a heavy apron. Then he gave the man one just like it. George was curious. Would he get one too? No, he did not. You get on that table, George, the doctor said. I'm going to take some x-ray pictures of your insides. He pushed a button and there was a funny noise. There, now you may get up. We have all the x-rays developed right away. And they put them on computers now, so they're still quick. Look at them all. Maybe you've had an x-ray at some point and the doctors had to look at you just like George. Now, let's see. There is something there that should not be, said the doctor when they were looking at the x-rays. Why, that looks like... I think that must be the piece that was missing from our jigsaw puzzle yesterday, said the man. Well, 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 said the doctor. At least we know what's wrong with our little patient. I'll tell Dr. Baker right away. George will have to stay in the hospital for a few days. We'll put a tube down his throat and get the piece out. It's only a small operation. I'll call the nurse and have her take you to the admitting office. Many people were waiting outside the office. George had to wait too. Look, Betsy, a woman next to him said to the little girl. There's Curious George. Betsy looked up for a moment, but she did not even smile. Betsy had never been to the hospital before, and she was scared. There they are looking at the x-rays, and there they are waiting to go to the hospital. Finally, it was George's turn. A pretty young nurse took him to the next room. My, how many rooms and how many nurses there were. One nurse wrote down a lot of things about George, his name and address and what was wrong with him. Another nurse put a bracelet on his wrist. It has your name on it, George, she said, so that everybody knows who you are. Then the pretty young nurse came back. My name is Carol, she said. I'm going to take you to your room now. We call it the children's ward. I will put you to bed. There will be lots of children to keep you company. I'm sorry if you hear the puppy barking downstairs. She's a new little puppy, and so she gets a little worried sometimes. And so it was. There were a lot of children in the room. Some were up and around, and others were in their beds, and a doctor and a nurse was looking after them. Dave was having a blood transfusion, and Steve had his leg bandaged and was sitting on a go-kart or a wheelchair. And Betsy was in the bed looking sad. And George got the bed next to Betsy. So there's all of the kids. Let's see if we can remember their names. Dave having a blood transfusion. And Steve with his leg bandaged in his go-kart or wheelchair. And here's sad Betsy. And here's where George will be staying. Can you see it? George was glad when he was in his bed again. His tummy was hurting again. The man sat with him for a while. Now I have to leave you, George, he said. I'll be back first thing in the morning before they take you to the operating room. Nurse Carol will tuck you in when it's time to sleep. Then he left. George sat there and cried. As he had promised, the man was back early the next morning. The nurses were keeping George very busy. One was taking his temperature, and one was taking his blood pressure, and one was giving him a pill to make you sleepy, George, she said, and one was getting ready to give him a shot. So here he is in his bed. And here he is sad, missing the man with the yellow hat. And look at all the busy in the morning. That's what happens when you have operations. They let you rest at night and then they keep you busy the next day. It's going to hurt, George, she said, but only for a moment. She took his arm and George let out a scream. But the needle hasn't touched you yet, said the nurse, laughing. There now, it's done. It wasn't that bad, was it? No, it really was not. And anyways, it was over now. Sometimes shots pinch for a little bit. That's why sometimes your mom will hold your hand. By the time the attendant came to the stretcher to wheel them to the operating room, George was getting very sleepy. He tried to stay awake. He was curious to see what would happen next. There's George getting his little scary shot. And there he is. Look, he has a little bandage for his shot. Down they go to the operating room. All right. He could see a big table and bright lamps in it, and the nurses and doctors all around. They had caps on their heads and masks on their faces, and only their eyes were showing. That keeps everybody safe. One of the doctors winked at George, who patted his head. It was Dr. Baker, who had been to the house when it all started, and he had a funny mask on too. And George fell fast asleep. And there they all are. And let's see. I believe this one is Dr. Baker. There you go. When George woke up, he did not know what had happened. He did not even know where he was. And then he saw Nurse Carol. It's all done, George, she said. We got the piece out, and in a day or two, you'll be running around again. The man had brought a picture book, but George felt sick and dizzy, and his throat was hurting too, because they had to put a tube down to help him during surgery. He was not even curious about his new book. He closed his eyes. We'll let him sleep, said Nurse Carol. The more he sleeps, the better. The next morning, George felt better. He even ate a dish of ice cream. Dr. Baker came to see him, and the man with the yellow hat, of course, came too. Betsy was watching him from time to time. She seemed a little less sad, but still she did not smile. Steve wheeled the go-kart over to George's bed. Tomorrow I can get up and try to walk, he said. Boy, I can hardly wait. Ooh. There he is. He's making friends already in the hospital. Good for him. That's what happens when we be kind and show love to people. I'll take you to the playroom now, George, Nurse Carol said in the morning, and in the afternoon your friend will come and take you home. The playroom was full of children, and the lady was showing Betsy how to use finger paint, and there were all sorts of things to play with, even a puppet theater, and that was just the thing for George. He had 4 hands, so he could handle 4 puppets at the same time. George gave a real puppet show with a dragon and a clown and a bear and a policeman, and the children laughed and shouted, and even Betsy, for the first time, smiled a little. Here they are, all in the playroom, and look, see what George found? And look at this! There he is with his 4 hands, because he's a monkey, you know. And he's doing a puppet show for the kids. And see? Betsy's got a little smile on her face. Good friends are so helpful. There was a TV set in the playroom and also a record player. George was curious. If he climbed onto the record player and turned the switch, would it go round and round like a real merry-go-round? It did. It started slowly and then went faster and faster, and whoopee! George lost his balance and was sailing through the air. They are watching TV, but what is George watching? Ooh. On he goes. Whoosh. And now he's flying through the air. Oh, I'm so glad there's a pillow for him. Luckily, George landed on a soft cushion, and the children cheered, and Betsy smiled again. George was so funny. But then the play lady picked him up. That's enough for now, she said. You'd better take a nap before lunch. We have a big day ahead of us. The mayor is coming to visit the hospital today, and later on you'll be going home, George. And when George woke up, Steve was just taking his first steps, and the nurse was helping him, and the children were watching, and the go-kart was standing there empty. George was curious. He looked at it, then he climbed into it. There's George getting dizzy. and taking him for his nap. Oh, he overdid it a little. And uh-oh. Uh-oh. Let's find out what happens. This is one of my favorite Curious George stories. Then he grabbed the wheels. And then while nobody was looking, he wheeled that go-kart right out of the room. George could make the go-kart go very fast. This was fun. Down the hall he went, and by now a nurse had noticed that George was gone, and she came running after him. "George! George!" she shouted. And look, oh, whoosh, down the hall. Uh-oh. But George was too excited to listen. He wheeled around the corner and down the ramp to the floor below, and some men were pushing lunch carts, and a lot of doctors and nurses were showing the mayor around. Uh-oh. There he goes, right into... Uh-oh. Never is dull with George, is it? George tried to stop, but it was too late. Wham! The go-kart landed right in the middle of everything. Lunch carts tumbled. Spinach and scrambled eggs and jelly jam were all over the floor. People fell all over each other, and George was thrown right out of the go-kart and landed right into the mayor's arms. Oh my. What a mess it was. "You broke all my dishes," someone cried. "You ruined the go-kart," complained another. "What will the mayor think of it?" whispered another. And so it went. Suddenly, everyone looked up and listened. From above there came happy laughter. And there stood Betsy, laughing and laughing. And then the children joined in. And then the mayor started laughing. And finally, everyone just laughed and laughed. Everyone, that is, except George. There they are. You see how happy Betsy is. But look at poor George. Aww. Betsy came running down the ramp, threw her arms around George and kissed him. "Don't be sad, George," she said. "The whole thing was so funny. I never laughed so much in my life. I'm so glad you were in the hospital with me." Now the director of the hospital spoke. "I am sorry this happened, Mr. Mayor," he said, "but I think we can just clean up the mess and be done with it." "George," he went on, "you made a terrible mess, but you also made our little Betsy happy again, and that is more than any of us have done. Now I see your friend has just come to take you home. So goodbye, George, and take good care of yourself." Aww. Sweet Betsy giving George a hug and a kiss to make him feel better. The children crowd around the windows, waving goodbye, and when George and the man in the yellow hat were finally leaving the hospital, as the car was turning into the driveway, Nurse Carol came running after them. "Here, it's a little package that belongs to you," she called, "but don't open it before you're home." There they are leaving, and there's Nurse Carol running with the package. George was curious. Well, who wouldn't be? The moment he got home, he ripped the package open, and there was the piece of the puzzle that had started all the trouble. "How nice of the doctor to save it for us," said the man with the yellow hat. "Now we can finish the puzzle." So he's opening the package, and there we go. And there's George. The end. Now, really, if you swallowed a piece of puzzle, it would get all messed up in your digestive system and it wouldn't look pretty to use in the puzzle again. But that makes a very cute story. Hey, have your moms and dads tell me of a time when either you were in the hospital and that was whether that was a funny thing like George had or whether it was a sad thing like Betsy had. And tell me of a time when you laughed so hard because something was so funny for you. All right. Thanks, boys and girls. Talk to you later.